Hello, welcome to INN News for March 14th. Then this is Headlines and Beyond. Uh, we begin today with an announcement that we are now on War Watch with Iran. We're watching for war with Iran as we inch closer to that, what I call the goal of APEC is war with Iran. But first, we'll start off with our recommended reading because, as you know, the best way to stay informed is to start reading and know the background history so that when you see something being said on the news, you'll have an idea of where this is coming from and where this is going. And today on our list is a book by a very about a very influential leader, not around that sort of around the 1960s. He was the counterpart to the Soviet counterpart to John F. Kennedy. His name Nikolai Khrushchev. Khrushchev, and there is a book out by his son Sergei Khrushchev called Khrushchev on Khrushchev. I'll put the details in the down bar below, so you can sort of find the book. I found it on Amazon very, very cheap. So it's not going to really set you too much back if you have a budget for your library. This being said, now let's get on with our headlines. As I said, we are now on War Watch with Iran. Today, Obama came out with a speech confirming that, confirming the suspicions that's been going on all along that we are preparing for war with Iran. And this was sort of topped up some of the CNN News on their headlines as they were bringing this out. They off, as they often do, show Obama speaking on various different issues, and so they naturally promote this. This line of the timetable for Iran to comply with its international obligations or else suffer the dire consequences, which basically means war, is the rhetoric that came out of AIPAC. It was stated by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu last week. So even though it's a few days late, we see Obama towing the AIPAC line. So he's basically being doing as he's more or less sort of, I don't want to say instructed, but strongly advised by his major supporters. And AIPAC, if anyone knows about AIPAC, and I strongly suggest you go look up the history of AIPAC. You can do a Google search on, and it's AIPAC, the American Israeli Political Affairs Committee. Look them up on the internet. You can find an enormous amount about them and who is involved. And they've been actually sort of pushing this line of going to war with Iran, and it's sort of been in the back news, and a lot of the blogosphere has been sort of buzzing about it, but it's sort of been lukewarm on the major media channels, except for a lot of the talk about Iran's having or getting a nuclear weapon. And this is what their whole issue, they say, is about. And today, though, things have changed because, before you had a lot of politicians coming out and talking about, then you had various different anchors pushing at this. The mechanisms that CNN uses to sort of push war, and they did this during the Iraq War, they pushed the American public into war, has begun. And this is why I say the War Watch is now on here, because I've been seeing certain things on CNN, particularly tonight, that leads me to the conclusion that we are now headed in a direction towards war with Iran. And this is a full-out, not a covert war, because we're already in the covert war. I'm talking about a hot war. You need to understand that there's two types of wars. There's a cold covert war. That's already on in Syria. And then there is a hot war. A hot war is a war. It's literally brinksmanship, because if we're dealing with nuclear weapons, we could end up in World War III. This is why the war watch with Iran is so important, because this could be the point that we enter World War III. This may be that entry point. And there are a number of valid reasons why this could be it. But what's happening that sort of led me to believe this? Well, today, watching several of the CNN broadcasts, I watched it throughout the day. They began showing a poll on the support for war with Iran, and they started showing that they said that there is a above average. There is a support for what they call a popular support for war against Iran. So that means they're saying is that the American public is behind a war in Iran. That if the United States starts a war with Iran, that the Americans are all for it. But the American people for it. Even though this is not what's showing up in the blogosphere. But the CNN poll that they were showing tonight, throughout the night, and throughout the day, was showing that you had 60% and above supporting war with Iran. That means, and that from their perspective, that the Americans now support, if Obama wants to go to war with Iran, then this is okay. And this may be one of the reasons why Obama came out and said what he said, because if he's been looking at the polls and seeing the shift in the polls, and feels that he'll have enough support for war with Iran, this may end up leading him to, this is now another thing to talk about, is an early pullout from Afghanistan and Iraq, and a move into Iran afterwards. So before he was talking about staying until the job is done in Afghanistan, and they were pushing back the pullout date to 2014. Now he's talking about an early pullout. Many people are speculating that he'll pull out before the elections. And this means that you could have an attack on Iran before the November 2012 elections. And this talk-up, the way the information is being presented on CNN with a lot of flyby graphics and sound effects and so on and so forth, is exactly the manner in which we saw the reporting that led up to the Iraq war, the Iraq invasion. Is the same, popular stance, the same popular analysis, the same, line of thinking that led us into Iraq is now occurring on CNN, but being aimed at Iran. But this kind of, is contrasted, but not necessarily contrasted, because they don't see this. It's contrasted by events in Afghanistan surrounding the soldier who they say went on a rampage and shot and killed civilians in a massacre in Afghanistan. And when I went on to a variety of different sources in BBC and Al Jazeera to look at what type of massacres have occurred in Afghanistan by what we call our soldiers, right, our side. And there are a number of events. This isn't just the first one. So this event in Afghanistan that now that Obama with Leon Panetta now in Afghanistan is trying to sort of quell and sort of cool off is one in a series of events. And the attention paid to it isn't as significant. In other words, compare what what's been done in Afghanistan in terms of our failings to protect the people, in terms of the soldiers attacking the innocent civilians. Compare this now to the way they're talking about the Syrian troops, right? The way how the Syrian troops are being reported when they're dealing with armed members of Al Qaeda in the streets, shooting things. And, when you could go back and you consider the numbers of civilians who were either hurt or injured in this that we know so far, is not anywhere near the numbers we see in Afghanistan and Iraq in terms of the civilian injuries and deaths committed by our own forces, by what we call our friendly forces. The people supposedly who are there to save these people. And they had on this is CNN, had on a person, a soldier, who was talking about that it's more than likely that this person who did the shooting was suffering from what they call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD, that's what it is, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is a sort of a means of explaining why someone goes berserk and what happens to them after a war. And it's sort of, they don't want to come out and say that war destroys the person and the personality. They don't want to say that, so they come up with these terms that are more academic sounding, more what they call neutral, rather than saying what it really is. And this guy simply went berserk, and this was his. He had just come back from Iraq, and was pushed out again to Afghanistan. And the thing is that if we look at what happened here, and we see that that if we pull our troops out of Afghanistan, and then send them into Syria and Iran, what's going to happen there? What's adding a new war in Iran going to do to the American soldier if we end up in war by next summer? So they're just going to be barely out of Afghanistan if they pull out of Afghanistan by the election. And then, right as they come out, they're going back into Iran. They're not going back in, but they're going into Iran. That's going to cause a huge, problem for a lot of these soldiers who are still struggling to adjust and cope mentally with what they've witnessed in Afghanistan. If what this soldier who was describing the horrors that they see on these tours of duties and how it affects these people, if this is true, and you can kind of see it if you go back and look at what happened to the returning soldiers who came back from, you can even go as far back as looking at the soldiers who came back from the Korean War, look back at the soldiers who came back from Vietnam. If you want to know where the Hells Angels came from, the biker gang, they were soldiers from World War II. So this kind of, post-war behavior by soldiers in terms of what happens to them can be consistently seen war after war. And the question is, when they come back from a war, and we keep pushing these wars one right after another, what's going to end up happening to the American troops? What's going to happen to, this, our American system, if this is kept, if they're pushed at the pace they're being pushed at? Well, some are now saying, this is said in the blogosphere, that what's going to be happening, and this is one of the reasons why they're going to try to push for war in Iran, is they want to try out the new drones and the automated war systems. They've been working on these. If we've been following anything on robotics or stuff like that, you'll see that the U.S. government has been working a lot on attack drones. They've been working a lot on these attack robots and mechanized warfare. They're going to try to do a lot more of this automated machine warfare. They hope to test these things out. This is from what I've been sort of reading and hearing on the blogosphere. If you go out to these other channels, that this is going to be a test bed for that. This is simply a test exercise. But the thing is that let's take the worst case scenario of these conspiracy theorists and say that this is an Illuminati plot to sort of destroy the world, and this is something about the Bilderbergs and so on and so forth. If this is the case, what you can always do is look back at history and see how well these things have succeeded in the past. And since the United States has gotten into these so-called interventionist wars, this is beginning in Korea, the United States has not succeeded at one of these wars. They have not succeeded at all in any of these wars. So when you look back and see what happened in history to these Bilderberg ideas, and all you see is failure from them, then one can assume that history will repeat itself, and that what you'll get from these Bilderbergs is yet another failure. That they haven't got anything new. They haven't got any sort of better ideas. They're not any more well informed than the previous crew who wound up destroying themselves. So I don't put too much of a stock in this sort of whole Bilderberg stuff, because the amount of flaws that are there suggests a repeat of the failures that they've had in the past. Now, this brings us back to Syria now, since we're talking about now we're on war watch with Iran, because Syria is the front door to this war. If Syria collapses, this will be the first signal into war. I said the longer the Syria holds up and remains intact, the more difficult and the further out the United States and Israel has to push the war, because they cannot get into Iran properly unless they have Syria. And this is sort of the sort of the common thought now. That here's where the complication comes in. One would assume Syria is the best path, but it's not necessarily the best path. It's now the only path left. They tried Iraq and failed in Iraq. Right? They could have had bases. And this is what President Bush was trying to do: is set up permanent bases in Iraq. That failed. They tried to set up permanent bases in Afghanistan. That has failed, because Afghanistan borders with Iran. So does Iraq. In both Iraq and Afghanistan, they've failed to achieve their strategic goals. They're now assuming that if they can topple Syria, that they can achieve their goals through Syria. But the question is whether or not, even if they do topple Syria, whether or not this will actually be the case. And the issue here is, and this is where, I said politics makes strange bedfellows. Iran typically supports a lot of Al-Qaeda and a lot of these suicide bombers. That we've seen them in Yemen, we've seen them in a lot of the Arab Springs. We've seen a lot of the Shia-led movements, which are essentially Iranians, where you have a toppling of a somewhat moderate government in terms of they're more moderate than the Islamists are. The more moderate government is toppled and replaced with an Islamic government. This is true in Egypt. This is true in Tunisia. This is true in Libya. Libya, they still have an enormous amount of problems in Libya because they can't get the weapons back from all the different tribal factions. The tribal factions in Libya are starting to war with one another. Um, and so it becomes an impassable place in terms of putting your ground troops there, but in terms of flying over it and attacking Iran by the air and with missiles, then you now have an open corridor from Israel to Iran through Syria if you can knock out their air defenses. And this is where I think that their thoughts are right now, is to go into Syria, degrade, or as much as possible degrade the air defenses so that they can easily or more easily attack Iran from that perspective, even if they can only do a few strikes at Iran. But the question is, if they do strike in Iran this way, what type of retaliation will Iran take? Particularly if Iran has a sufficient number of weapons that now can reach Tel Aviv. The view on the ground from Tel Aviv is that it doesn't. People say, the AIPAC, which is primarily an American group, it's not an Israeli group. It's actually an American group. While it is pushing for this type of an attack, and says that they can stop most of the missiles reaching Tel Aviv, the people on the ground in Tel Aviv says no, because you're not the ones who are going to die. And this is where you now have a disconnect between the political organization AIPAC, which is supposed to be acting in the interest of the Israeli people, but isn't, is acting in the interest of Israeli policy, and the Israeli people themselves, because the Israeli people themselves in Tel Aviv don't want this attack to occur, because they know that even if 2 or 3 missiles get through, that it's going to have a devastating attack on Tel Aviv. And these people don't want to die. I mean, I don't know anybody who wants to die. Even these jihadists, you see these jihadists talking on about suicide, like what's his name, Osama bin Laden. Did you ever see Osama bin Laden with a suicide vest on? No, he convinced other people to do it, but he didn't do this himself. I mean, how many of these mullahs and muftis and all these Islamic leaders who encourage these wars, these uprisings and stuff like that, how many of these people themselves will go out and kill themselves in the manner that they encourage other people to do? Most politics, even when you see people who are somewhat idealistic, and I'm going to say somewhat idealistic because even if they're up there screaming about their ideals, these people have never stepped off that podium and blown themselves up. They have never sacrificed themselves. They expect other people to do it. And that's what these speeches are for. These speeches are not to get themselves off their couch in bombing and blowing up a place with their own body, wearing a suicide vest. It's to get other people to do this. So most political leaders that you see up on the news, they're there for self-interest and egotistical reasons, and they will not sacrifice themselves. And this is true on the Western side. This is true on the Syrian side. This is true on the Iranian side. This is true on the Israeli side. Nobody wants to die. So, but the thing is we always have these people, though, up there talking about sending people out to war without considering the consequences. That's it. AIPAC, which is a political group, very popular, very powerful in the United States, has the power to influence, is a normal influence over the French media, over the UK media, over Al Jazeera now, over the American media, over Canadian media, most Western media, which is either corporate or government sponsored, have a strong are strongly influenced by AIPAC. And while AIPAC sets up there and says that it's working for the Israeli people, when you go into source their news, their claims in Israel, among the people of Tel Aviv, among these people, the different areas, the only place you can actually find the AIPAC line, and even there it's not unanimous, is among the more radicalized Jewish settlers, who themselves are not specifically Israeli. Most Jewish settlers are transplants from other places. They're immigrants who are Jewish immigrants, believe strongly in this biblical state of Israel, and are working on their ideals. And part of their ideals is that the men don't work at all. The government provides them with all the support that they need in terms of basically it's a massive welfare state, because the men aren't supposed to work. They're supposed to be studying the Torah all day long. So they don't want to go out and work. And this means that somebody else has to pick up the tab. And this is the current state of Israel. That you have the Jewish settlers being supported by the rest of the Israeli population. And the large chunk of the Israeli population who live in Tel Aviv and the cities don't necessarily agree or in the same frame of mind as the Israeli settlers are. And you see this when you start sourcing your news in Israel to see how what's being presented by AIPAC in the mainstream media, like I said, the corporate and government media that we see here in the West, is not exactly the same thing that you see on the streets of Israel. It's not the same view. There is a very strong disconnect. And this is what I say, you really have to sort of, rather than simply watching the news and believing everything you see, you do have to read, you do have to study. There is an enormous amount behind a lot of the geopolitical events that are going on in the world today. And this is true. You can find, and this is where, if you're wondering how do you resolve all these problems that are in the world, well, this is where you can actually find hope, because if you go into the Israeli environment and you think that everybody hates the Arabs there, well, that's not true either, because what you can see in the Israeli environment, in the Israeli streets, is you can see there are a good number of Israeli peace groups who are working to help the Palestinians, who are working to, they're working with these people to sort of, help them out of the situation that they're in. I mean, a lot of the reporting that you get on Gaza, on the West Bank, and the events going on there, and the horrible conditions that are going on, come out from Israel, and they're from Israeli peace groups. So you can't just simply, with one broad stroke say, wow, all these Jews, they're all horrible, they're all bad people. You can't say that, because if you actually go sit down and you study this isn't what you see. You see an enormous amount of diversity, and if you can see in this diversity here that there are opportunities to work with other groups, even though you may not necessarily agree with everything. If you can find something you can agree to work on together, then that's what you do. That's how you step forward and try to move the issue of peace forward. You don't move the issue of peace forward by saying, "Oh, that dictator over there, he's a terrible person. Let's bomb him into submission. Let's assassinate. Let's destabilize the entire nation so we can have regime change." That's not how you resolve problems in geopolitics. If you want peace, if you don't care about peace, then that's the way you go about doing it. Anyways, I'll see you. This has been another night of the news, and I'll see you tomorrow night.